In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. O hearts that seek truth, O eyes that weep for the oppressed, O souls awakened by the call of justice. We have entered the sacred month of Muharram al-Haram, the first month of the Islamic calendar. But this is no ordinary beginning. This is not a time of celebration or festivity. This is a time when history cries, when heaven mourns, and when every believer's chest tightens with pain. Because Muharram begins with remembrance. It begins with blood. It begins with Karbala. On the first of Muharram, Imam Hussain ibn Ali, the beloved grandson of the Holy Prophet, arrived in the barren land of Karbala. He was not welcomed by flowers but by swords. He did not find peace but a storm of betrayal. And yet, he did not turn back. He planted his tents on that dry earth, knowing this would be the land of his martyrdom. Knowing that every drop of blood spilled here would become a river of light for the oppressed of every era. Karbala is not just a place. It is a message. It is the voice of Hussain echoing through time saying, if you see truth being buried, rise, even if you stand alone. It is the lesson that faith is not proven by silence. It is proven by sacrifice. In Karbala, there were only 72 standing against thousands. But they had something the enemy never could. They had certainty, loyalty, and divine purpose. Each of them wrote their names in the book of eternity, not with ink, but with their blood. Ali Akbar, the son whose face shined like the prophet. Qasim, the young nephew who longed for martyrdom. Abbas, the flag bearer whose loyalty was unmatched. And the infant Ali Askar, whose silent martyrdom shook the throne of Allah. And at the heart of it all stood Hussain, alone, wounded, grieving, yet unbroken. He stood not because he hoped to win the battle, but because he refused to surrender to falsehood. His last prostration on the burning sands of Karbala was not the end, it was the beginning. Because from that sajda, Islam rose again, not in power, but in purity. And let us not forget Zaynab and Sak, the sister of Hussain, the voice of Karbala. When the swords were silent, it was her words that roared. When the enemies thought the story had ended, she began it. From the throne of Yazid's court, she declared the truth. Not with an army, but with dignity. Because Karbala teaches you truth does not die when the swords fall. It lives when the tongues rise. O believers, Muharram is not just for tears. It is for transformation. Cry for Hussain, yes, but also walk in his footsteps. Don't just wear black on your clothes. Wear his courage on your soul. Don't just beat your chest. Awaken your conscience. Stand with the oppressed. Speak for the voiceless. Resist injustice in all its forms. The month of Muharram is sacred because it holds the pain of the Prophet's household. But it is also powerful because it reminds us that one stand can change the world. Hussain did not die in Karbala. He lives in every heart that refuses to bow to tyranny. So let us raise our hands not just in mourning, but in prayer. Let us bow our heads not just in sorrow, but in submission to the truth Hussain gave his life for. Let Karbala live in us every day, in every choice, in every breath. Ya Hussain! First Muharram. The arrival of Imam Hussain in Karbala on the first of Muharram, the land of Karbala witnessed a moment that would change history forever. On this day, Imam Hussain ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, stepped onto the plains of Karbala. Not as a conqueror with an army, but as a leader of truth, a symbol of resistance, and a sacrifice waiting to be made for the survival of Islam. The Imam looked upon the land, silent and vast, and said, this is the place where our blood will be spilled. This is where our tents will be set. This is where our journey will end. He was not unaware of what was to come. Karbala was not a surprise. It was destiny. It was a divine stand where a small group of pure souls would write with their blood the eternal line between truth and falsehood. The journey to Karbala had begun with letters, with hopes from the people of Kufa. But Imam Hussain did not come for power. He came because the truth was being suffocated, and the name of Islam was being worn by tyrants who betrayed every value it stood for. As Imam Hussain set up his tents on that dry, dusty land, he knew this was not a place of safety. It was a place of sacrifice. Alongside him were women, children, and only 72 loyal companions, each one ready to give their life not for worldly gain, but to preserve the message of the Prophet. Karbala was empty that day, but soon it would be surrounded by thousands of soldiers. Soldiers not sent by disbelievers, but by those who claimed to be part of the Muslim Ummah. This was not just a physical battle. It was a spiritual test. First Muharram marks not just the start of the Islamic year, but the beginning of the greatest stand in the history of Islam. It marks the arrival of the one who would give everything. Family comfort, even his 6-month-old baby, for the sake of justice. O believer, let this day remind us that Imam Hussain did not choose Karbala. Karbala was chosen for him by the command of Allah as the field upon which the banner of truth would be raised, never to fall again. Of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Muharram is not just the first month of the Islamic calendar. It is not merely a marker of time. It is a season of remembrance, a time when hearts are weighed down with grief and eyes overflow with tears. It is the month that echoes with the cries of Karbala, the wails of the women, the silence of the martyrs, and the voice of truth that still shakes the skies. Muharram al-Haram, the sacred month, is not only sacred in name. It is sacred because it bore witness to the greatest sacrifice in human history. It is sacred because in its very heart, on the 10th day, the plains of Karbala were painted with the blood of purity, courage, and unwavering faith. This is the month when we remember not just the tragedy, but the triumph of the soul. We remember a man who stood not for revenge, not for power, for pride, but truth. We remember Imam Hussain ibn Ali, the grandson of the Holy Prophet, who rose when others had fallen silent, who refused to bow to tyranny, and who taught the world what it means to live with honor. even if it means dying with dignity. Muharram teaches us that silence in the face of oppression is a betrayal of faith. It reminds us that numbers mean nothing when truth is on your side. In Karbala, 72 souls face an army of thousands. They were denied water, they were surrounded, they were offered safety in exchange for silence. But they chose martyrdom over humiliation, sacrifice over submission. What does this month demand from us? It demands reflection on our lives, our purpose, our loyalty to the path of righteousness. It demands that look beyond ritual and into the essence of Islam, to stand for justice, to serve the oppressed, to reject every form of tyranny, whether external or internal. It demands mourning, not just in tears, but in transformation. To mourn Hussain is to change our lives. To beat our chests is not enough. Our hearts do not beat for the causes he died for: truth, dignity, faith, justice. Muharram is not a history to be remembered once a year. It is a legacy to be lived every day. When you hear the call of Karbala, ask yourself, am I on the side of the oppressed or the oppressor? When you wear black in this month, ask her, is my soul as dark as my clothing? Or does it reflect the light of Hussein's message? When you cry for the thirsty infant of Hussain, do you also quench the thirst of the needy around you? This month is not about death. It is about awakening. It is about rising from the ashes of complacency and saying, like Hussain said on the day of Ashura, I did not rise to create corruption or injustice, but to reform the Ummah of my grandfather. Let us take this month as a new beginning. Let us renew our allegiance not just in words but in action. Let our lives, our homes, our families, our hearts all echo one messaging. Every day is Ashura and every land is Karbala. Imam Hussain entered Karbala fully aware it was the land of sacrifice. This was not a journey of surprise, nor was it a path taken blindly. Every step that led to Karbala was purposeful, deliberate, and grounded in divine foresight. Hussain had been informed, through the legacy of his grandfather, the Prophet N, and through the vision of his father, Imam Ali, that a time would come when truth and falsehood would clash not just in ideology but in the open plains of the world. Karbala was the chosen stage for this divine test. As the caravan of Hussain approached the barren land, his horse stopped. The air was still, the ground was dry and unwelcoming, but the Imam's heart was firm. He asked about the name of this place, and he was told, this is Karbala. The moment he heard the name, he knew this was the place where the pain would begin, where trials would descend, where blood would flow. He gazed upon the land not with fear but with solemn resolve. He ordered the tents to be set. He declared, here is where our blood will be shed. This is where we'll meet our fate. This awareness was not merely intellectual, it was spiritual. Hussain did not walk into Karbala as a victim of circumstances, but as the master of his destiny. He did not arrive expecting ease. He arrived expecting sacrifice. His heart carried the knowledge that this land would soon carry the bodies of his companions, his sons, his brothers, and eventually himself. But he came still, because the mission was greater than life, and the truth more important than survival. And the companions with him, the family surrounding him, all saw the determination in his eyes. He was not afraid. He did not hesitate, and this certainty became their strength. The children may have been tired. The women may have sensed unease. But Hussein's firmness made Karbala bearable. His calmness gave them courage. His vision gave them clarity. They were not here to win in numbers. They were here to win with values. He came not to fight for control of land, nor to claim a throne. He came to defend the soul of Islam. He came to expose a system that wore the name of Islam but crushed its heart. He came so that centuries later, believers would still remember that standing for truth means standing even when death is certain. He came because if he had stayed silent, the message of his grandfather would have been lost in the palaces of corrupt rulers. As the tents were raised and the camp settled, Karbala transformed. This dry, desolate field was now no longer ordinary land. It had become sacred by the footsteps of the Prophet's family. Every inch of that ground would soon be touched by sacrifice. Every breeze that passed would carry the whispers of dua and devotion. Every shadow cast by those tents would bear witness to the greatest stand in human history. Hussein's entry into Karbala was not the beginning of tragedy, it was the birth of eternal resistance. His awareness of what was to come made each moment heavy with meaning. He looked at the land not as a battlefield, but as a stage for the preservation of Haqq, the truth. He was not brought to Karbala by accident. He brought himself there, willing, knowingly carrying with him the torch of truth, prepared to pass it on with blood if necessary. This knowledge shaped his every action. He prepared the hearts of his companions. He gave farewell sermons. He spoke of patience, of purpose, of the mission beyond life itself. He was a man who had already accepted martyrdom before a single sword had been drawn. The journey that led Imam Hussain to Karbala was not fueled by a hunger for power, nor was it a political move calculated to gain control. It was a journey born from the deepest roots of principle, morality, and truth. Every decision made by Hussain was guided by a commitment to uphold the integrity of Islam, to protect the message of his grandfather, the Prophet Muhammad N, and to reject tyranny in all its forms, regardless of the cost. The road from Medina to Makkah and from Makkah to Karbala was paved with moral clarity, not political ambition. Hussain was never in search of a throne. He was already the leader in the hearts of the righteous, already the beacon of guidance for those seeking truth. What he could not accept was the forced allegiance to a man who had turned the caliphate into a kingdom, who openly violated the teachings of Islam, who oppressed the people, silenced the scholars, and revived the arrogance of pre-Islamic tyranny. To give allegiance to such a ruler would be to legitimize injustice, to place a seal of approval on the destruction of prophetic values. That is why when the letters from Kufa came, thousands upon thousands, pleading for his leadership, Hussein did not respond as a politician would. He did not send an army head or make claims of power. He sent his cousin Muslim Ibn Aqil to verify the truth of the people's request. He responded as a man of integrity responds. Carefully, sincerely, and without desire for worldly reward. And even when the tide turned, Muslim was martyred and betrayal spread through Kufa like fire, Hussein did not turn back out of fear. He moved forward, not because the numbers were on his side, but because the truth was. Had he wanted comfort, he could have stayed in Mecca. Had he wanted safety, he could have disappeared quietly. But Hussein was not driven by safety. He was driven by the duty to stand when standing was needed most. He was the living verse of the core, and that commands believers to rise for justice, even if it is against themselves. The world may have offered him security, but his conscience would never allow silence. He knew the price of speaking out. He also knew the cost of remaining quiet. The journey to Karbala is the ultimate example of principle over politics. It is a lesson for every age, every generation, every believer who will face the test of standing against injustice. Politics demands alliances and compromise. Principles demand sacrifice and truth. Hussein chose the path where he would lose everything outwardly, but preserve everything inwardly. He chose the path that led to death, but gave life to a movement that would never die. Karbala was not a battle for control of cities. It was a defense of the soul of Islam itself. When he reached Karbala and set his camp, he did so with full knowledge of what was to come. No one was deceived. Hussein told his companions that they would not leave Karbala alive. He gave them permission to go. He released them from their oath. Yet they stayed, not for political gain, but for the same principle that had brought him there. They stayed because they too believed that some causes are greater than life, and some stands are more powerful than survival. This journey continues to teach the world that the path truth is rarely the path of popularity, that principle must stand even when politics fails, that to oppose injustice is not an act of rebellion, but a duty when silence becomes betrayal. Hussein walked to Karbala not as a seeker of victory, but as a servant of truth, prepared to pay the ultimate price so that future generations would never forget the difference between power and principle. Karbala was a barren desert before they arrived. It was a land without glory, without gardens, without history. But when the caravan of Imam Hussain, the grandson of the Prophet, stepped onto its soil, something changed forever. That dry land became sacred. Not because of any monument or structure, but because it bore the footsteps of those hearts were filled with truth, whose intentions were pure, and whose lives were soon to be sacrificed for the sake of Allah. It became sacred not by store or river, but by the presence of al-bayt, the purified family of the Messenger of God. Every inch of Karbala carries echo of their voices, the imprint of their struggles. When the hooves of Hussein's horse touched that soil, when the tents of the family of the Prophet were raised, the unseen world recognized this land. Angels descended, the skies trembled, and the land itself became a witness to the highest form of human submission. The dust that once flew freely in the wind now carried the scent of destiny. Karbala was chosen by divine will to be the theater of sacrifice, the ground upon which the greatest battle between truth and falsehood would unfold. When the children of Fatima walked that land barefoot, searching for water and witnessing pain, their small feet imprinted purity into the sand. When Zaynab stood tall under the burning sun, watching her brothers and sons fall one by one, her shadow fell on the ground like a flag of resistance and patience. When Ali Akbar rode out to the battlefield with the beauty of the Prophet in his face, and Ali Askar was lifted in his father's hands toward the sky, that land held their blood, their cries, their final moments. The cries of the thirsty echoed through Karbala, yet that thirst purified the soul of the Ummah. It was not water that sanctified the land. It was the lack of it. It was the patience of those who endured without complaint. When Hussein placed his forehead on that earth in sujood in the final moments of his life, he did not just bow in worship. He consecrated the land forever. That place, drenched with blood and sacred submission, became more than just geography. It became a maqam, a station of nearness to Allah. Karbala became the resting place of the martyrs, but also the rising place of the message. Those who died, they were buried under its soil, but their cause rose above the heavens. The blood of Hussein and his companions did not vanish into the ground. It flowed through time. It turned that once forgotten land into the spiritual capital of the oppressed. Millions would walk to it, cry over it, and find light in its dust. It is no longer just a physical location. It is an eternal reminder. It is a reminder of what happens when the purest souls choose principle over survival. It is a reminder that the family of the Prophet, even when abandoned, even when surrounded, even when outnumbered, turned a battlefield into a shrine. They gave their lives not to be remembered, to ensure the truth would be. But their memory became inseparable from that truth. Wherever Karbala is mentioned, the names of Hussein, Zaynab, Abbas, Ali Akbar, Qasim, and Ali Askar rise like stars in the night sky. It was the footsteps of al-bayt that changed Karbala. Their prayer tears, their sacrifices turned sand into sanctity. Every tear that falls for Hussein today lands on that sacred earth, spiritually if not physically. The pilgrims who walk barefoot toward Karbala in mourning retrace the same steps, seeking to carry a fraction of the burden that was carried by those noble souls. Karbala was once unknown, but because of them, it became known to the heavens, to the angels, to the lovers of truth in every generation. On one side stood a humble camp of 72 loyal souls, and on the other an army of thousands equipped with weapons, pride, and worldly power. But it was not a battle of numbers. It was not a war between equals in arms. It was a confrontation between truth and falsehood, between sincerity and hypocrisy, between divine purpose and worldly ambition. When Imam Hussain arrived in Karbala and pitched his tents, he was not preparing for survival. He was planting the flag of eternal resistance. Those tents, simple and fragile in appearance, were the walls behind which the greatest principles of humanity stood upright. The tents of truth were not protected by stone walls or mighty warriors. They were guarded by faith, sincerity, courage, and love for Allah. They held women, children, and the most loyal of companions. People who had no worldly motive, political gain, no material reward. They stood only for the preservation of the Prophet's message. When those tents were raised, the world witnessed something that had not been seen before, in the purists standing with full awareness of what was to come, still refusing to surrender. Each tent had its own role. Some held the warriors preparing their hearts for martyrdom. Others sheltered the women whose patience would become history's lesson in endurance. Some were places of prayer, where the words of the Quran through the lips of those who knew they would not see the next dawn. The simplicity of those tents hid a majesty unmatched in human events. They were tents of truth, not because of their fabric, but because of who was inside them and what they represented. Across the battlefield, the army of falsehood stood in arrogance. They had horses, spears, banners, and numerical strength. They had the support of corrupt rulers and the silence of a deceived majority. But despite their outward might, they lacked the very spirit that gave the tents of Hussein their unshakable strength. They were built upon fear, greed, and obedience to injustice. Their hearts were dry, their purpose hollow, and their cause built on lies. They feared the very light that shone from Hussein's camp, even though there were many and he was few. The contrast between the two sides was stark. One side prepared for death with sujood, while the other sharpened swords without cause. One side fasted, prayed, and wept in the night. The other drowned itself in delusion, thinking it was victorious before the battle had even begun. But history would show that it was not the army with the greater numbers that won. It was the side that carried the truth, even if it was torn down tent by tent, soul by soul. When the battle intensified, the tents of truth became symbols of resistance. The enemies not only sought to kill the men, they targeted the tents, burned them, and scattered the women and children. They thought that by destroying the tents, they would extinguish the message. But those flames only spread the truth further. The smoke of those burning tents still fills the hearts of believers, reminding them of what was lost and what was preserved through sacrifice. When Imam Hussain set foot in Karbala, he did so not with the hope of survival, but with the certainty of sacrifice. He knew that he and his companions would not leave that land alive. He knew the swords that had once been raised in honor of the Prophet were now in the hands of those ready to slaughter his very bloodline. Yet despite this certainty of death, Hussain stood tall. He did not tremble. He did not retreat. He did not seek a way to save himself at the cost of truth. He stood because justice was greater than life, and standing for it worth dying for. The choice before him was clear: to give allegiance to a tyrant who had trampled every Islamic value, or to refuse and face annihilation. It was not a political dilemma, it was a moral obligation. To accept injustice, even in silence, would have been to betray the message of his grandfather. And so Hussain chose the harder path, the path that led to hunger, thirst, grief, and death, because it also led to eternal dignity. He knew that history would forget kings and forget armies, but it would never forget the one who gave his life for the truth. The night before Ashura, he extinguished the lights in the camp and gave his companions a choosing to leave in the darkness without shame. He told them that enemies sought only his blood, not theirs. But they stayed. Not one soul walked away. Why? Because they too understood what Hussain stood for. They knew they were not just walking toward death. They were walking into history with honor. They had seen with their own eyes the purity of their leader's cause. They saw in him not a commander, but a reflection of the Prophet's soul. Even as the battle began and his dearest companions fell one after another, sons, brothers, nephews, childhood friends, Hussain did not falter. With each martyr, his heart was torn, but his spirit never wavered. When Abbas, the flag-bearer, fell by the river, Hussein's back bent with sorrow, but his resolve stood firm. When his young son Al-Akbar breathed his last on the battlefield, Hussain raised his face to the sky and said, "O Allah, bear witness to what this people have done." And when the 6-month-old infant Elias Shah was struck in his arms, he did not cry out for vengeance, but for submission. He lifted the baby's blood to the heavens and returned to the battlefield with dignity no sword could destroy. It was justice that gave him strength, not revenge, not anger. He fought not out of hatred, but out of duty. His stand was not for personal survival, but to prevent the distortion of Islam. He was not defending himself. He was defending the souls of generations to come. He stood knowing that his blood would water the tree of truth, that his sacrifice would awaken hearts long after his body was gone. He turned Karbala into a message, a mirror, a movement. Hussain could have saved his life. He could have taken a route of compromise. But he chose principle over preservation. His stand teaches that real justice sometimes demands the ultimate price, and only those with vision beyond this world can pay it. He stood not because he would win in this world, but because he would win in the sight of Allah. His body would fall, but his voice would rise. His limbs would be cut, but his legacy would walk across centuries. Even as he stood alone on the burning plains, wounded, surrounded, exhausted, he held his sword like a torch and his tongue like a banner. He cried out not for mercy, but for meaning, not for rescue, but for remembrance. The enemies thought they had silenced him, but all they did was immortalize him. For even in the face of certain death, saints stood for justice, and by doing so, gave justice a voice that will never be silenced. When the dust settled on the plains of Karbala, the battlefield stood as a silent witness to a truth that would echo through time. That righteousness is not measured by numbers, nor is truth determined by majority. Imam Hussain stood with 72 companions against an army of thousands. By worldly standards, he was surrounded, overpowered, and doomed to defeat. But by the standards of faith, he was the victor long before the first arrow was shot. The moment he refused to bow to injustice, the moment he stood for principle despite the overwhelming odds, Karbala ceased to be a scene of loss and became the eternal stage of moral triumph. Throughout history, people have often been deceived by appearances, assuming that the larger crowd, the louder voice, or the more powerful side must be right. Karbala shatters that illusion. It shows that truth can walk alone, that justice can be carried by a handful of brave souls, and that a single stand for what is right can outweigh the voices of 1,000 who follow falsehood. Hussain did not need an army to be correct. He needed conviction. He needed clarity. And with that, he became the definition of success in the eyes of heaven. Those who surrounded him believed that strength lies in numbers. They came with thousands of soldiers equipped and well fed, emboldened by authority and the comfort of the masses. They believed they could crush the truth beneath the weight of their numbers. But what they failed to understand is that might is not measured by how many stand behind you, but by what you stand for. Hussain stood for the message of the Prophet. He stood for the dignity of the oppressed. He stood for the preservation of Islam's soul. And for that, he did not need more than a few hearts that shared his vision. The companions of Hussain were not wealthy or powerful. They were not generals or rulers. They were slaves, sons, brothers, and loyal believers who knew they would fall one by one. They were aware that death was not a possibility. It was a certainty. But they followed Hussain not because they expected victory in this life, but because they believed in victory in the next. Their loyalty was rooted in faith, not fear. Their courage came not from numbers, but from belief. Even on the day of Ashura, when the sun rose over the desert and the enemy's banners cast long shadows, the camp of Hussain was filled with light. The world saw a small group standing against a massive army, but the heavens saw the defenders of truth standing against an empire of lies. Those 72 were not outnumbered. They were elevated. Their names would be remembered forever, while the names of the thousands who fought against them would fade into disgrace and obscurity. Karbala teaches that being right is not about being popular. It teaches that if you stand for truth, even alone, you are never truly alone. Divine support does not follow crowds. It follows sincerity. It does not bless those who conform to oppression. It uplifts those who challenge it, even with the smallest of means. The stand of Hussain became eternal because it was never about the outcome. It was about the intention. It was not about winning a war. It was about refusing to lose one's soul. In every era, this lesson remains vital. When injustice is widespread, when the oppressors grow in number, and when standing up means isolation, Karbala reminds us not to look at how many stand beside us, but at what we stand for. The legacy of Hussain proves that one man, with pure faith and righteous purpose, can awaken the conscience of the world. That is why Karbala is not the story of defeat. It is the living reminder that numbers never define righteousness.